100-year anniversary of the Treaty of Sèvres. So my plan today is to look at the original treaty, show you guys some maps of those territories, talk about why it was reworked, show you the map of the Treaty of Lausanne, and then move forward and talk about the impact of the treaty on today's Middle East, in particular looking at President Erdogan and some of the actions that he's taken recently, and if that has a connection to the Treaty of Sèvres, and then end with a couple discussion questions for you guys. Okay, so following the end of World War I, UN diplomats gathered in a porcelain factory, which I found kind of ironic considering that this only lasted a couple of years, in a Paris suburb of Sèvres, and they signed a treaty to remake the Middle East. So you have France, Britain, and Italy, all representative of the war's victorious powers, kind of forcing the Ottomans, the defeated government, to sign this treaty and creating different European spheres of influence. So the plan collapsed really quickly, but many of the articles that I read talked about how even though it was short-lived, the Treaty of Sèvres had some long-lasting consequences and can be seen in how has impacted, regional politics today. So this was probably the best map I could find of the Treaty of Sèvres. Those are not mountains. It wanted me to buy the map for $8, and I thought, no thanks. But it shows you Britain and France marked out separate zones of colonial influence there in the pink for the British and the blue for the French. And motivated, like we talked about earlier, from the lucrative oil concessions and other natural resources in the area. And then Greece and Italy securing their own holdings in western and southern Turkey, including retaining control over the Aegean Islands. Istanbul we've talked about frequently, and that was put in an international zone since it was in a strategic strait. And then the ethnic Armenians and Kurds would have been granted their own autonomous state. And the Ottomans were left with what they saw as a kind of humiliating reminder of the empire itself. Then we get into, after the treaty is signed, the European powers encountered a lot of resistance. The picture on the left is of them signing the treaty in the porcelain factory. And then the other picture is of Mustafa Kemal, a Turkish nationalist who organized Turkish ranks, even had some Kurdish fighters along with him, rejected the treaty and waged war that tried to cast out these outside nations and imperial powers, and pushed them to settle on new terms in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. So that's what gives us Turkey's modern borders and how we recognize it today. But the memory of those outside nations attempting to deprive Turkey of their sovereignty and their power is deeply ingrained in Turkish politics. So the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 defined new borders. Greece had to surrender Smyrna and Eastern Thrace. Kurdistan lost its autonomy. And I think when we look at some of the lasting impacts of this treaty, Turkey then reaps all of the economic and political power of that region. Italy, before that, going back to Turkey, they got all of those gains out of the Treaty of Sèvres in the Treaty of Lausanne, but they did accept that Palestine and Syria were to be mandated to Britain and France. Italy retained the Dodecanese, and Britain held Cyprus. The Dardanelles remained demilitarized and open to shipping, and were supervised by the League of Nations. But the final settlement of the Turkish-Greek border resulted in a large refugee crisis of the time, and over 1 million Greeks were forced to leave Turkey, and some 350,000 Turks were forced to leave Greece. Moving toward the impact of the treaty today, I pulled this picture from Dr. Romano's article that he wrote in an Arab News last week. And Sèvres certainly plays a role in Turkish sensitivity in the Kurdish separate issue. Last year, around this time, when Trump pulled troops out of Syria, we saw Erdogan's actions against them, and Dr. Romano mentioned several of the revolts in Iraq. So I think we could certainly say that Kurdish statelessness might be one of the fatal flaws of the Treaty of Lausanne. And then another action in looking at some more modern Turkish actions beginning in 2014, and then recently into January of 2019, Turkish drones and military support have helped the Tripoli-based government in Libya's civil war. And Erdogan, in connection with Libya's backing, has secured maritime exploration and potential oil drilling rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's put Turkey in direct conflict with other countries in the region like Greece, Egypt, Cyprus, and France. So you mentioned earlier, and correct me if I have this wrong, but Turkey and Qatar back, I lost how to pronounce his name, Sarraj, and then Egypt and the UAE support Haftar.
Yeah, and Russia too, and the Gulf countries, and France.
So the conflict over the drilling rights to massive natural gas deposits in the Eastern Mediterranean is becoming increasingly militarized in the last couple of weeks. We're seeing a conflict between Greece and Turkey, who are both NATO members. The foreign minister of Germany has tried to come in and mediate. He visited Turkey and Greece last week and urged a dialogue between the two countries, warning both countries against any further military escalation. And I have this quote up on the board: "Fire is being played with, and any small spark could lead to catastrophe." So while Germany is trying to mediate, four of its fellow EU members, France, Greece, Cyprus, and Italy, are engaged in military exercises involving ships and planes off the coast of Cyprus. Their purpose is to deter any sort of Turkish aggression and further energy exploration in those waters. They're also using warships and jet fighters as well. And then this one, I wanted to take a closer look at Turkey's deal with Libya and exploring those maritime rights and oil drilling. So you can see there that pathway between Libya and Turkey. You can see that it's an expansionist strategy to claim those waters and the resources in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean that have been previously controlled by Greece and other countries. And that plan envisions Turkey taking over the Greek islands where hundreds of, thousands of Greek citizens live. And by creating those exclusive economic zones and conducting exploration and establishing future gas, they're getting in the way of the pipeline, which is in the bottom right picture, that's trying to be built. And then one last piece here. Like I alluded to earlier, many of the articles that I read talked about the Treaty of Sèvres and connected that to a lot of Erdogan's actions, as these were significant gestures that he was making in this maximalist approach, expansionist approach, to demonstrate that Turkey is not as weak as it used to be. So this humiliating defeat in the Treaty of Sèvres, they want to be able to overcome that and be perceived as a powerful country that's capable of enforcing all of its interests. Erdogan has said some really inflaming statements. The ones on the side here, says, "We don't have our eye on someone else's territory, sovereignty, and interest, but we will make no concessions on that which is ours. We will not compromise which what ours. We are determined to do whatever is necessary." So it's really like strongman mentality and very strong words in opposed to Greece. So I wanted to wrap up here and ask you guys a couple questions and get your feedback on it. And we can start with the top one and then move down to the second. But what do you see as the most significant legacy of the Treaty of Sèvres? And then secondly, moving forward, what steps or solutions do you think should be considered? And then talking about how those would affect regional politics or even international outside nations that are involved in those as well.
This is where any of you can jump in.
I would say we mentioned before with this legacy of European intervention being very labor politics, that's sort of, against this, but it's really interesting as part of Turkey's in the UAE, right?
I can't hear you so well, Mara.
Or
Yeah, I just
yeah, no,
I didn't hear the very
excuse me,
last
I
part.
am just off on everything today, in European Union.
Yes.
So I was gonna say, but it's interesting that there's this, I guess, bad karma or bad feelings towards Europe, but they're part of the European Union.
Right. I thought that was something that's going to be a major point of contention is the fact that Greece and Turkey are both NATO members. Turkey wants to be a part of the EU but is not, correct? And so I thought maybe, and this is getting into the second question, that may be a bargaining tool.
Yeah, they've given up on Europe. Erdogan doesn't really want it. Turkey wanted it from like 1950s onwards, but Erdogan just used it to get the military out of politics because you have to be democratic to enter the EU. But now that he's fully in power, he's happy to look eastwards.
Doesn't matter anymore. I think for me to start the conversation, like I mentioned before, in rewriting the map from Sèvres to Lausanne, it makes Turkey the successor state. They get to reap all of the economic and the political power in the region. And I also think the question of Kurdish independence also has got to be one of the most impactful legacies of the Treaty of Sèvres. Yeah.
I think it depends on what perspective you look at. Like, from the Middle East nations' perspective, so far as I know, like the Turks are unhappy. They're going to revoke this treaty and saying that okay, we had we lost part of it, especially when it comes to the oil-rich areas like Kirkuk and Mosul. So Arab nationalists probably they say that. They divided our nation because there are a lot of islands and small countries. And Kurds maybe are the biggest critic of the treaty because, as you mentioned, that it was supposed to have their own country, but in the Lausanne Treaty in 1923, they missed the chance. So I think that the dynamic is still going on, and there are a lot of
There's something for this first question. There's something that Jennifer referred to in Turkey. It's called the Sèvres complex, and this is the widespread paranoia in Turkey that just like the Treaty of Sèvres 100 years ago was seeking to divide the country and had to be thought. Treaty of Sèvres, lay aside the minority rights issues and everything, which were good. It was really a kind of Treaty of Versailles, the way that treated Germany. The Treaty of Sèvres was treating the Ottoman Empire. And one person described it as a peace to end all peace. Same as Treaty of Versailles. So in the Turkish nationalist perspective, this was like a plot for the European powers to keep Turkey forever weak, give the Greeks the west coast and the north, and give the Armenians this and the Kurds that. But now, 100 years down the road, they still think, when like the U.S. cooperates with Kurdish forces in Syria, that this is a plot to divide Turkey. Right? They still think they're after their territory. And sometimes it's crazy conspiracy things you hear, but it has a political effect.
Yeah, and it can be utilized.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think paranoia and pride, can last a long time. Like this has been 100 years, but you're still seeing manifestations of, you're talking about, like strongman words and the very aggressive actions that they took after that because their pride as a country was hurt. And, they felt like they had to avenge for that. And I think that has to be considered. Going on to your second question, when you're incorporating international politics, when you're crafting treaties, you have to be mindful of, not only is this going to make peace, but is it going to have longevity, and what are the actors going to feel like when they go home? Because if they're upset, if they have that inner turmoil, it's going to create conflict, not solve it.
Right. Give people wins.
Right,
Give
absolutely.
something that they can hold on to.
This isn't necessarily like answering this question, but kind of like I sort of had my own question for you. I I guess, kind of like opinion-based, but looking at the kind of political developments that have happened in Turkey with Erdogan and the, like, not even just like the strongman, I guess, sort of position that he's taking, but his efforts to kind of infringe upon the sovereignty of other nations in, building that pipeline and everything. Do you think in a way he's almost trying to harken back to like the glory of the Ottoman Empire and kind of like rebuild that kind of national mythology, whether that's for like political reasons or like actually for the good of the country?
Right. A lot of that feels that way, like that maximalist, aggressive approach. And it sounds like eerily familiar to me, a lot of the things that Hitler said when he was like, I'm just taking what's rightfully ours, right? It's our sovereignty, these are our territories, and like makes this line in the sand about where he wants. So I agree, and in mentioning other actors, Israel and the West Bank, Russia and the Crimea, he isn't the only one that's doing that now. Yeah.
This might be going off on a tangent, but it also just seems a little, I wonder what it's going to look like if the right to protect ever becomes an issue in Turkey in terms of international intervention, just because of this kind of complex that everybody has. So I just think that is also something that we could keep on the radar too. I don't know how close it is going to be to that at all, or if that would ever even occur. It would just be interesting.
Yeah, I had some in here that wrote down. On the first or second, Erdogan for tomorrow, and the next day he has some military somethings that are going to be happening in that area too. So it seems like he's looking to escalate, or at least threatening that
Naval
we're gonna escalate
maneuvers in
this
the
situation
Mediterranean.
too.
You have to keep in mind, Turkey is the second largest army in NATO after ours. I mean, they're pretty big.
Any other final comments or thoughts? Yes.
Turkey's, I get really consolidated in power and trying to take advantage of its more historically stable position versus other ethnic groups and other stateless entities in the area. Even though Turkey up until the year 2000 was largely unstable with military coups every 15 years or something. To me, it seems like they're trying to, especially with the Kurdish issue, as they see Kurds as a direct challenge to their power in the area, and giving them a separate state would directly challenge them. So they're trying to force ties with other countries to shore up their position as they move further from there.
And I think they're in a great geostrategic area as well.
Because they cut off the Suez Canal too, if they take control of the Eastern Mediterranean.
Right.
What you hear in the explanations often in the media with Erdogan's behavior on this with the Mediterranean and him bringing up Sev all the time and so forth is he's been in power since 2002, and people are getting sick of him, and the economy, like you mentioned, is in free fall. So what does he do to substitute? Because he's, that middle of the pyramid where he's buying people off with goodies and services is kind of exhausted. He's got to find legitimacy from somewhere, so he goes out trying to get it from, the glory of the past Ottoman Empire, of the modern Turk, and he gets mileage. And it's a source of political legitimacy.
Right. Distracting from this issue and focusing on this one
Exactly.
as a rallying cry.
So would you say he's trying to create legitimacy through nationalism, or?
Well, Turkish nationalism nowadays is a fusion of Sunni Islam and Turkish identity. He does well with these conflicts, rhetorical conflicts with the West, which is why he's not really interested in Europe anymore. He gets much more mileage when France is sending ships to go contest Turkish ones. He does not want an actual war with a real opponent. you know, attacking Kurds who don't have a state, or Syrian irregulars, or Haftar's forces in Libya is one thing. But if Turkey were to get into a real war, the economic problems it has now would be, so he just wants the rhetoric
Yeah.
to get political mileage out of it.
And I think with the U.S. elections looming, there's, maybe this shortened time frame
Yeah.
for that. He's got leniency with the Trump presidency.
I think you're absolutely right, because Biden has said some serious criticisms against Erdogan, calling him a tyrant and a dictator, whereas Trump is like, you know what Trump said to the pastor, Pat Brunson, who was held as a hostage by Erdogan's government in Turkey for 2 years as a political leverage? Trump had him at the RNC convention with some other hostages, and the guy's thanking Trump, saying, "You got me out of there. You didn't leave me. I would still be there if it weren't for you." So he's doing what you expect. And then Trump says to him, "Well, Erdogan has always been good with me."
Like he's an old college buddy.
Yeah, he starts singing Erdogan's praises. How do you think this guy was hostage on trumped up charges for 2 years feels like? I was just like, what? Anyhow, thank you very much, Jennifer. And now with the last 20 minutes, let's talk about the state a bit. Well, talk about decolonization and creation of the state in the Middle East. Okay, so we talked about colonialism and the pernicious effects of it, although some improvements and advancements come as well. It's a complicated story, but we